This is Elise Gross with the Presser Law Firm. Today's webinar is on liability insurance and asset protection. I've been an attorney for 25 years in South Florida. I work with the Presser Law Firm. We do asset protection and estate planning here. We have a weekly newsletter. If you're not already receiving it, please send an email to info@assetprotectionattorneys.com and we'll get you on the newsletter. We also do webinars once a month. We alternate between estate planning and asset protection. Please take a look at the end of the webinar. There's a slide which will give the information. I believe it's May 23rd at noon is the next webinar. And if not, it's in our newsletter. We also provide complimentary preliminary consultations in the event that you would have any questions on estate planning or asset protection. We're happy to answer them and see what we can do for you. I'm also an adjunct professor at Florida Atlantic University, where I teach wills, trusts, and estates. I have with me today Rick Gross from RPA Insurance Services. And Rick and his wife, Jennifer, operate a local insurance brokerage. They insure commercial clients, business owners, building owners, condo associations, homeowners associations, restaurants, and Rick has been in the insurance business for 40, we're going to go with 40 plus years. And there is no relation between Rick Gross and Elise Gross. It's just coincidental that we do have the same last name. So the way we're going to do this today is we're just going to kind of go back and forth. I'll be asking Rick some questions. He'll be giving us some really good basics on liability insurance, and I'm going to tie it in with why liability insurance is fantastic and why asset protection is still necessary. So we're going to be talking about liability insurance today. We're going to talk about asset protection. We're going to talk about the types of insurance coverages, and we're going to really specify and direct this to business owners and commercial property owners. So first, Rick, why don't you tell us a little bit about define what is liability insurance?
Well, hello, everybody. Glad to be with you today. And again, my name is Rick Gross, and we'll just start talking about, to begin with, I think, general liability insurance, because that's one of the main areas that business owners need to make sure that they have protection for it. And it provides the insured party with protection against claims resulting from injuries and damage to people and or property due to the action or inaction of the insured. Basically, if you're negligent and your negligent acts causes an accident and injures and damages or damages other people or their property, then you could be liable because you were negligent. Negligence is failure to do what's reasonable and prudent in a situation. So it's very important for you to have liability insurance, whether it be commercial auto liability insurance or whether it be general liability insurance. You need these things as a business owner. And it also includes costs of defense. Usually within the regular policy limits, it's included. Sometimes carriers for more hazardous types of accounts have separate limits outside their regular limits so that they can limit how much they have to pay in a defense situation. But normally it's policy limits. Typically under a general liability policy, you'd start out with $1 million per occurrence limit. And then they have what's called a general aggregate limit, so that it's usually 2 times whatever the occurrence limit is, which would be $2 million. And that means the total amount of limits of policy year. If you had 2 claims for $1 million, then they would max out at paying the $2 million in that situation. If you had 3 for $1 million apiece, they're going to max out at $2 million. So typically it's $1 million per occurrence and $2 million general aggregate. You also, if you can have products and completed operations coverage, but that's if you're a contractor, you need completed operations coverage. That's for when you finish the job and something happens that you were responsible and negligent, and somebody gets injured or damages their property. That's for usually construction.
And we're going to talk we're going to go into the more specifics.
Okay.
That was, let's introduce it there.
Good start.
And then on the asset protection side, those of you who are not familiar with what asset protection is it's basically the legal and ethical process of protecting your personal and business assets from future potential creditors. So when you do asset protection, you want to be proactive, which is why the insurance is a great first line of defense. So you always want to plan everything in advance, because if you do end up getting sued and getting a judgment against you, what you had in place before that liability is going to be critical. And the more you have in place before, the better options you have to plan. Planning things after the fact, you're much more limited as to what you can do. And with regard to asset protection planning, it doesn't matter how much you have. If you have a high net worth or a modest net worth, it doesn't really matter. Everyone can use that asset protection, can use that protection from creditors. An example I like to use there is if you're a teacher and you've worked all your life and you've managed to amass a few $100,000 in assets, and you get sued because you have a car accident and you have your insurance coverage, but it only pays so much. If you get sued for $1 million, that's going to wipe you out. Whereas if you're a professional athlete and you're earning $5 to $10 million a year and you get sued for that $1 million, it's going to be an irritation. It's going to take time and energy, but it's really not going to affect your life so much. So it actually planning for somebody who has less is really almost more important than planning for somebody who has more. But since nobody really wants to, pay out on the creditors for things that aren't their fault, or if it's their fault, they want to pay less, you want to have a plan regardless. So Rick, why don't we go through some of the different types of liability insurance, and maybe spend a little bit of time just telling us about the ones from this list that you think are, we really need to hear about.
Well, like I started to say earlier, that I think it's very important that business owners or building owners have a general liability policy, which is we were talking about earlier. And also, if you're if you have folks handling money, you need to think about having a commercial crime policy, because you need to be concerned whether employees perform a dishonest act and cause you to have a financial loss. You would want to have that covered. And you've got money and securities coverage, which is robbery and all those kinds of things that you need to have. Consider that. And if you're manufacturing a product, then you would need products liability, and that's all part of the general liability policy typically. If it's a real hazardous product, then it might be a separate policy. You need to be concerned about, if you have employees, you certainly need to be concerned about having workers' compensation coverage. If you have, in Florida, if you have 4 or more employees, then you're required by Florida comp law to carry your workers' compensation. If you're in the construction industry, if you have 1 or more employees, you need to carry, you're required to carry workers' compensation. So
I have a question on that. So workers' comp, I've never really understood the whole concept of it. If somebody gets injured on the job, let's say they slip in office, is that covered under the liability policy, or is that covered under workers' comp?
No, under the general liability, there's for anything that's covered under workers' comp. So if it's an employee and the employee slips and falls, then it's going to be the workers' compensation that responds if you have it. If you don't have it, then you've got to be concerned about your assets aren't being protected properly.
Right. That means the employee, if there's no workers' comp, the employee can sue the employer.
Now, if you have comp, then the Florida law says that they're not able to sue. You buy the comp with the idea that then they aren't able to sue you.
So is workers' comp covered? Is that like a federal or a state-backed insurance?
It's the National Council of Compensation sets up all the rates and the rules and everything. So that's a national thing, and each state has their own set of rates, file for their own set of rates. And It's medical. The benefits to the employee are medical at once without limit, and there's a certain amount of disability coverage available for it, depending on the type of injury, whether it's permanent, temporary, partial, and then there's some accidental death benefits there too. But the whole idea is you buy it so that it's in lieu of the employee's ability to sue you.
Even if there's negligence?
It's not regards to negligence. If an employee gets hurt, it just responds.
And isn't there some type of insurance where if an employee is driving a car for the employer, is that under workers' comp, or is that I think I've heard there's other type of policy on that?
Well, if you have a business auto policy, and if there is, you also have work comp. In that situation, work comp is primary for the employee if they get hurt.
Got it. Okay. Interesting.
Now you have personal injury coverage under a business auto policy. So that's the first 10 in Florida is the first $10,000. But even so, it's still the workers' comp that's primary. Okay.
And so if I'm an employer, what on this list would I want to have, or would I want to have all of it?
You'd want to have the general liability insurance. If you have 4 or more employees, you're required to carry them, even if you have one. And so that way, if they get hurt, they can. Then you need to think about having crime insurance.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. And you've got employment practices liability insurance. There's lots of sexual harassment and wrongful termination lawsuits that are becoming much more common, and oftentimes that can be added into as an general liability policy.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got a couple of things here that tells us what commercial liability insurance does cover. You want to point out here, or
well, you can see here that it says. Remember, we were just talking about how workers' comp there. That's an exclusion. For the general liability, it says employee injuries, and that's because they're covering workers' comp.
Got it.
A lot of the way the commercial policies work is almost all of them. If there's available coverage in another policy, then, for instance, under general liability, they'll say, well, that's the work comp, we'll put an exclusion on general liability. And then workers' comp says, well, we're not going to be responsible for liability to the public. We're only going to, so it's an exclusion under the work comp, you see.
Got it. But it's covered somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
that's
so
right.
when you sit down with a business owner, you look at, okay, you need this policy, you need this policy. Here are the things we need to fill. There are gaps that might be.
Work together,
Got it. Okay.
Fills all the gaps.
Okay, and then I take just a second to tell us a little bit about the exclusions. We don't really need to go into much, just that there are certain exclusions.
Well, there are certain exclusions. Under a general liability policy, if you have an intended injury, it was a wrongful action, you intentionally injured someone, then that's going to be excluded under your coverage. Contractual liability, there is some contractual liability coverage under a general liability policy. Typically, one that's normal is lease contracts are typically covered under there. Most contracts are not, and there's exclusions for that in there. Pollution liability, typically under general liability, they want to exclude that, and it's possible to buy that on separate policies. It's not inexpensive, that's for sure. War is a standard exclusion. Terrorism is a standard exclusion, but the federal government got involved a few years back, and they said insurance companies must offer it, and they do.
Right.
Both on a general liability and on the property policy, and they do. It's for an extra dollar amount usually, but a client can choose to exclude it if they want to and not pay for that extra money.
Right.
And then property within your care, custody, and control. That's one of those policies under general liability. There's exclusions for property within your care, custody, and control, and the reason is because you buy regular property insurance for your buildings and for your contents. Fire, wind, hail, riot, strike, smoke, explosion, direct damage type coverages.
Right.
All right.
Perfect. Okay, and acts of God. Hello, hurricanes. Welcome to Florida. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about this occurrence versus claims-made policies, because what we're really not focusing on today, but it's not something that Rick does. It's usually, very specialized insurance for, call it malpractice insurance, whether it's for doctors or lawyers or CPAs. And so as an attorney, obviously, we have such policies, and it's very important to have them. They do, what you choose to include them, what your limits are, those are all up to you and to your insurer. But there's different types of policies. So there's the occurrence policy, which basically means that regardless of when the claim is reported, it's going to be covered under that policy. So if you have company A in 2010, or here, let's use the example I put here. If you have company A in 2017, you then get insurance in a later year with another company, call it company B. If a claim is brought, a couple of years later, if it's still within if it occurred back when you were covered under company A, it's company A that you're going to have to file the claim with. Whereas a claims-made policy is you are covered on the date you're covered. Whenever that claim is brought, that's who you bring it to. The key there, and I remember this from my policy, is you have to have a retro date. If you're not retroactively covered, then they're not going to, a claims-made policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, is not going to cover you for that occurrence.
That's correct. If it occurred before the retro date.
Right, it's not covered anyway.
Make the claim.
Right.
Then it could, that's right. So you got to make sure you got to pay the retro date.
Right, and you were saying, I think it was claims-made policy, you were saying that D&O coverage, which we're going to talk about in a moment, directors and officers coverage, and is often claims-made. Always claims-made, and products liability.
Products liability for manufacturers is almost always claims-made. One of the more hazardous types of products.
Got it. Okay. Just a moment on this. Obviously, as an attorney, this is a sweet spot for me. A lot of times, you get insurance with the knowledge that the insurance company is going to cover your defense costs. And Rick and I were talking about this, and apparently there can be caps on it. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about, you were telling me before, like I said you said that there's policy limits on the legal fees sometimes, and other times it's above.
Yes, that's correct. If you buy a regular, let's say, talk about general liability to begin with. If you buy a general liability policy per occurrence and a $2 million general limit, most companies will just automatically put the defense costs within those limits without any specific limits on those.
So if I have $1 million limit, my limit
is for $750,000, and the legal was $300,000, and they're only paid $1 million, and you
still have to
50.
Right, you'd have to pick up the balance.
But some companies on more hazardous types of clients,
okay,
they'll say, well, we're gonna the judgment is in the $1 million limit per occurrence, and then they'll say, well, we want to limit the defense cost dollar amount, $500,000, $250,000.
And then anything above that you have to pay. But you don't get to choose the lawyer. The insurance company chooses the lawyer, right?
Not always. I've seen it happen.
Oh, really?
I've seen it happen. Most of the time, the insurance companies want to prevail with that. But I've seen it on some of my condos on bad lawsuits where the client refused counsel that the insurance company recommended, and they refused to use them, and they negotiated with the insurance company to use someone else.
Right, but the insurance company has the control.
They have the final say, but usually, yeah.
And do you see where people, I think I've heard of this, where people, even if the insurance company is covering the defense, where they also get their own individual counsel? Have you seen that?
But the insurance company usually doesn't pay for that.
No, of course not. Gotcha. Okay. So a lot of what we do in asset protection is protecting properties. So when we protect a piece of property, very often what we'll do is we set it up and put it in a limited liability company. So just if you can spend a moment and just tell us what kind of coverages you want if you have a property in an LLC and what somebody should look for in terms of things that might not be obvious to them in terms of coverage.
The first thing I think is that we should chat a little bit about who's part of the insured, because
Okay.
we're talking about,
That's fine.
we're talking about property, and you don't have to change this.
Okay.
Property and liability coverages, which is one of the main things that you
Okay.
need if it has to do with insuring things and contents and a business inside a building, business interruption. But you know, there's a firm called Insurance Services Office drives all the forms that all the insurance companies use, and it's referred to as ISO. And ISO has these side in written policy provisions which the point is, liability companies, they define corporations as part of the named insured, and it also can include property managers, and all that is defined in this endorsement and policy provision by ISO that all the insurance companies use. And so therefore, when an insurance agent writes a policy and puts together an application and puts in the section of the named insured, we use the specific entity name, and you usually have to identify the FEIN and everything for the insurance company. You send it to the underwriter, and then whatever that particular entity is activates this coverage part here in this coverage. So, corporation, then it defines who's insured. Into that right away. Now,
Okay.
as far as the property and general liability coverage for a building owner, you know, you want to insure the building for fire, wind, hail, riot, strikes, smoke, explosion, theft, vandalism, damage from broken pipes. All those are the typical named perils, but usually you buy a risk policy. It's called all risk is kind of an old-timey term, and I'm an old guy, so that's why I keep referring to that. But and anyhow, it's special perils, and you know, you would buy all those perils, and then you would insure the building to whatever the replacement cost is of the building. And oftentimes, insurance companies want you to get an appraisal to verify to them what the value of the building is. Oftentimes, not always, but most of the time. And you know, in Florida, you know, we're so prone, especially in South Florida, the whole state really, to catastrophe with hurricanes. You know, the insurance companies all require heavy, high percentages. They use percentages as deductibles for the named hurricane storm. So as soon as the storm gets named by NOAA, then it becomes a percent deductible type situation. It's usually either 3% or 5% of the value of the building. So if you have a $1 million building, then it's going to be 10% would be, you don't have 10%, 100,000. So it's 30,000. 3% would be $30,000. So on $1 million building. So as you can see, it's a pretty hefty percent deductible.
And that means that you have to pay that first.
Right. 30. It has to get above the 30,000 before you get any benefits from the company. The next level would be 5%. So, you know, then in that situation on $1 million building, it'd be 50,000. The other perils deductibles usually are, you know, 5,000 or 2,500 or whatever. And, you know, the marketplace down here is much more limited. You know, you're not going to see regular big name insurance companies writing homeowners or writing commercial buildings. You don't have Zurich or St. Paul Travelers or you know, Hanover or the big name companies, Allstate, State Farm. They don't want to write expose themselves, these carriers, to the catastrophe exposure of hurricane. So that's why you have all these smaller local Florida name companies writing homeowners in Florida, because the other companies just don't want to be big. So, but you can get a general liability policy from a lot of those companies down here. They just don't want the catastrophe of the wind. So anyhow, so the other policy you would want for a building, you would insure the building for building coverage, for whatever the limits of the building are, you know, depending on the square feet and the construction and all that, and you get an appraisal to determine that. And then on contents, how much ever your contents you think you have are, and contents are if you take the top of the roof off the building, turn it upside down, anything that falls out is contents. So that's an easy way to figure out what contents is. And then, you know, you have business income coverage, business interruption coverage, which basically provides for loss of continued expenses plus some profit, you know, to help you get started back again if you have a claim from a fire or hurricane or whatever it may be. Those are all the main coverages for property coverage for buildings and contents. Then, you know, you would want to get your general liability, which is the slip and fall. If you're manufacturing a product, you know, then it'd be the product's liability. If the product acts up and injures somebody and bodily injury or property damage occurs, then that's the product's liability coverage. And it's legal costs and payouts or judgments for which the insured party would be responsible if found legally liable. Again, that has to do with your negligent. If you have not been done what's reasonable and prudent, then you can be thought of as negligent and therefore liable. And intentional acts are always excluded on all general liability policies.
Now, if I'm the owner of a LLC and the LLC owns a building, am I insured if I do something wrong in the building?
Yes. That's part of the definitions under the name insured.
Got
As
it.
you read these things, you'll see who's part of the name insured under an LLC or a corporation. It includes the owners.
So like manager, members,
Yeah, so
property manager, if I hire a property
is
manager?
included, yep, and it's right here. Yeah, it's named here specifically. Yeah. Also, you know, remember that if you own a corporation and you have a couple other main players in the corporation, stockholders, you know, if an attorney, if somebody comes, a claimant comes to an attorney and gets the attorney involved, he's not only going to name that individual, he's going to name, a good attorney is going to name the entity as well.
Right.
So, you know, but even if they just name the individual is covered by how it's defined here on who is insured. Okay.
Interesting. So from an asset protection standpoint, I like the LLC because you do have, just in the realm of being an LLC, you have manager and member liability protection. Exactly. And then depending on where the LLC is set up, how many members are going to be critical. Like for instance, Florida, if I've got a single member LLC owned by an individual, if I'm the only owner of it, somebody can get the property. If they sue the LLC, they can get whatever's in it. But if they
can't get any of your personal assets.
They can't get any of my personal assets if they sue because of something that happened on the LLC. But if they sue me personally for something else, they can take my LLC. In Florida, if it's a single member LLC, because they allow foreclosure. And in states that allow foreclosure, the LLC is actually still vulnerable. So, you know, you want to kind of protect from the inside out and the outside in. But with regard to, you know, you want the insurance as that first line of defense, no matter what, on your property. Now, I understand you can get separate property and liability policy, or sometimes you can get, what's it called, like a package, a comprehensive?
Well, it just depends on what's available. You know, if you insure a commercial building in Ohio, they don't have hurricane there. You know, they have tornadoes, but they don't have hurricanes there. So it's a little easier to find more available companies, and oftentimes it's just a little easier. You'll get a property and a liability policy together on one policy.
Package policy.
But down here, especially in South Florida, the companies are so stringent and are careful and cautious about writing property coverage, fire, wind, hail, strike. So, you know, it's such a shrunken, limited availability of the carriers that are available. Oftentimes, you have to just buy. The agent can find whatever products that he can find on the shelf that are available to him. And oftentimes that causes it to be just a monoline property policy for the building, and then a separate general liability policy, because a lot of companies don't want to do the package down here. You know, depends on the kind of structure it is, of course, but sometimes you can find it.
Especially now the windstorm is getting a little less problematic.
It's you know, we've had a couple 3 years now of bad storms. You had Irma, and you had So it's still fairly competitive right now, and you have some competition, which is keeping the renewal costs down. But if we get hit for another year, we've had a couple big years of storms, so Wilma and Irma and some of the others that have hit up in Mexico City and all that, it was really pretty bad. We've had some catastrophes the last couple of years. If we have another year of bad storms, we'll see the market change. It'll be less competitive, fewer companies, and that means the price starts going up.
Right.
Right now, it has been fairly contained. The companies have had plenty of retained earnings from the years that they didn't have storms to be able to offset and overall. And, they got their money from the reinsurance companies and they paid their claims. And they haven't had that knee-jerk reaction to raise the prices yet. But if we have another year after 2 or 3 of them that have been pretty catastrophe prone, it might change things. So we'll see.
Okay. And what about excess liability?
Excess liability is that's an extra set of extra layers of limits. Okay. So on a general liability policy, if you have $1 million per occurrence and $2 million on general or aggregate, you can buy an excess liability policy. You can buy it at $1 million. You can buy it at $2 million. You can buy it at $5 million, $10 million, $25 million. The agent can go out and access these markets and get you quotes for those different limits. So if you have a lot of assets to protect in the entity name,
it has to be in the entity name.
Whatever the entity is on the name insured, and whatever that entity owns. If you own $10 million worth of buildings, then if you buy a general liability policy for $1 million, that's not going to be enough to protect the $10 million worth of assets that you have. So then you need to think about buying an excess liability policy. So if you bought a $5 million excess liability per occurrence, $5 million general aggregate, then on the excess, then it would be you have $1 million on the primary per occurrence on the GL primary. You had the access to it at $5 million. That means you'd have 6 total. Okay, and on the general aggregate, if you have $2 million, which you normally do on a general liability policy for general aggregate, then you add the $5 million to that, so you'd have $7 million on the general aggregate, which is the total limit of the policy year for the claims. Okay,
and that's a secondary policy.
It's a separate policy, and it kicks in after the first policy is exhausted. Okay,
that's a good idea.
And it can go over your business auto.
Okay.
But you have to have, usually you have to have a $500,000 limits, liability limits on the business auto to be able to get the umbrella.
Right, you have to have bottom limits. Right.
Primary policy limits have to be to a certain limit level before the umbrella or the excess liability will come in on top of it. Okay. So, and it'll go over other types of liability policies as well. Excess will.
Covered that already. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about directors and officers insurance. So if down here in Florida, we have a lot of condo associations, homeowners associations, and for instance, Rick and I are part of the same networking group, and we were talking about this. I'm on the board of that networking group, and he's been on the board in the past. And there's directors and officers insurance to protect us as board members in the event of somebody suing for some event, for a financial injury. Right.
Maintaining where we've done something wrong, or even if we haven't done something wrong.
Right. It just protects us
still there.
Because they're going to try to sue me personally as a board member.
Defense. That's right.
Right.
They can name an individual, you'd have coverage. They can name a whole board, you'd have coverage.
And is this something that's a different policy? Is it a separate policy, or is it part of?
It's not part of general liability, huh?
But is it do you get a separate policy, or do you get it as additional coverage under the general policy?
It's usually not part of the general liability policy. Rarely.
Right, and so with the directors and officers insurance, you would also get, probably when you're doing that, you might get the crime policy along with it, because often there's money being involved.
Again, there are separate policies, but typically, yes, you see oftentimes for clients, if they buy crime, they're usually sophisticated, they want to buy the directors and vice versa.
Okay.
Especially if they're handling money.
Right, I mean, so if you're a condoist, you want the crime policy.
Well, actually, the crime policy association is required by Florida Chapter 7 condo law.
Right, and that's also going back to those condo policies. Don't you have? And you were talking earlier about valuing the building. There's a requirement I know in Florida where you have to get the building
Appraisal every 3
reappraised.
years for a condo.
Right, and probably a lot of people know that, but
well, if you're a good insurance agent,
right,
is aware of that. Because now there's no police running around with his head telling them you got to get it done. But the problem is if you don't have it done, and the building keeps getting higher in value because construction costs go up, labor costs go up, and everything, and it just costs more to have a building replaced than it did 10, 20 years ago.
Right.
And if you haven't been doing it, haven't had the appraisal done recently, the next thing you know, you're underinsured and you have a co-insurance done, you don't get the full percent of the loss.
Can you explain that co-insurance? Because I've never really quite understood what that's about. Like I see it, and people have tried to explain it to me, but maybe you can explain it.
It's really not too difficult. It's the insurance company has a policy provision that says that they want you to carry a percentage of what it actually costs to replace the building.
Okay.
It's a percentage, and it can be 80 or 90 or 100%. The insurance agent can help you determine what percentage to use for that.
So if I have $1 million building.
If you have $1 million building and you have an 80% co-insurance clause, then that means that you're agreeing that you're going to insure it for at least $800,000.
Okay.
And if you don't, let's say you insure it for $400,000, then you're going to be a co-insurer with the company because they're only going to pay you what you did, $400, divided what you should, $800. You're only going to get 50% of a claim. So it's very important. It's very important that the agent and the insured take a look at what the co-insurance percentages are on your policy and make sure that your appraisal is up to date, because if you haven't done an appraisal for a long time, you may not know that it's worth a lot more than what you thought it was. And then the next thing you know, you're underinsured, and then you have a partial claim and you only get part of a claim paid. So
when you make the claim, they're going to determine the value, and
they look at it and they decide how much the value should have been.
Right.
If you have an appraisal done in the last couple of years, they'll just say, oh, well, you had the appraisal done, we'll use this.
That's kind of scary because most people don't, if you've owned a building for 20 years, most people aren't reappraising it unless they're financing it.
And agents have a good feeling for people who do commercial insurance, typically know what it costs per square foot of a building to put a building back up. If it's a concrete building with a concrete roof, or if it's a concrete walls with wood joisted roofs, we have roughly the cost per square foot in our head, or we have access to know what it is, multiply it out and see if the limit looks reasonable and close, and then we'll go with that until we can talk the client into getting the appraisal. And if they don't get the appraisal, then we make sure we have it on their proposal that we recommended for them to do it. And then if they have a problem and they get mad and say, at the time of a claim and they don't get the full percent of the payout, then they can't come back and say, you didn't tell us that. Here it is right here.
That is the perfect answer to asset protection, because you've got to cover yourself on what you're doing.
Sure.
And, people very often don't take the recommendations of whether it's the insurance agent or the lawyer, whatever it is, and then they end up in a bad position. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, why, we have professional, liability insurance. But, the clients have to understand that you've got to insure properly, and you've got to make sure you're always insuring properly. And that may require, updates and reductions and increases. And then on top of that, you want to make sure you've gone to see your asset protection attorney to make sure everything else is protected, because the insurance is going to be great. The insurance hopefully will pay. It doesn't always pay. There's, whether it's exclusions, whether, you're going to fight with them over coverage, and, something that wasn't covered, or you did something that, made the policy in default, whatever it is. So you've got to be personally protected as well.
Yeah, we have insurance. Our agency does.
Right.
Emissions coverage on claims.
Right. So there you go.
For millions and millions of dollars. And,
right, but it's not only just for professionals. Right. I'm talking about, we have clients in here who own
properties, multiple real estate properties, and each time they have property, they are supposed to put it in a separate LLC. That's really the best asset protection that they can be afforded for having a piece of property. when they do that, they have to have separate insurance, which means that they're going to have a liability policy and a property policy. What I've seen, and from my own personal experience, is sometimes you can have one liability policy that covers multiple properties, but you generally have to have a separate property insurance policy for each property. The alternative is you may have an option, depending on where you live and what insurance carriers are available, to have what we call a package policy, where you can have liability and property on the same policy. It's just a comprehensive package policy. But of course, the main thing to get from that is that you never want more than one property in the same LLC unless they're of little value, in which case you can do a cost-benefit analysis and determine whether or not you can put 1 or 2, 3, if they're really small properties, inside the one LLC. The reason we caution you on this is that if you have multiple properties in the one LLC, number one, they're covered under the same policy, which means there's only a combined insurance limit on that. Number two, from an asset protection standpoint, if something happens on one property and somebody sues that entity because of that incident, then they're going to have the ability to get at all the properties that are in that one LLC. So if you separate them out, then you're creating a much better plan where a creditor can't get at the multiple assets. They can only get at what's in that one LLC. So we've talked a lot about insurance today, and Rick's given you a lot of really good information. And the bottom line is that insurance is absolutely, the first line of defense, but without the asset protection component of it, without the planning that goes into it, and how do you own the properties, the insurance is only going to go so far. You also have to worry about, are all losses even going to be covered? Is there a lapse in the policy? Does the insurance coverage only cover up to a point? Does it eliminate certain coverages? Does it exclude certain coverages? There's a lot of different things that can play into this, which is why insurance is certainly a good move, but it is not the answer. So you want to make sure you talk to your professional, your insurance professional, your asset protection attorney, you get the proper advice, get the proper coverage, get the most coverage that you're willing to spend for insurance, because it'll probably cover you on legal fees, or at least to some extent, and it's definitely the first line of your defense before you even have to present the asset protection plan to tell your creditors, good luck, sue me all you want, you're not going to get anything because I've got it protected. So what are the top 3 takeaways from today? Well, number one, no reason not to have insurance. It's reasonable in cost. There's a lot of different coverages you can get. It fills in the gaps of an asset protection plan, because an entity, even if you have your assets in an entity, you still want to insure them. You're going to confer with the insurance professional, somebody who really knows what they're doing. You're going to confer with your attorney and make sure that your properties, your businesses, your personal assets, that everything is properly titled so that you get the best of both worlds. You have the insurance coverage, you get the creditor protection, and that would make a total comprehensive plan. I want to thank Rick for joining us today and sharing with us about insurance. As a reminder, we have a weekly newsletter. If you are not receiving it, please email us at info@assetprotectionattorneys.com. We also offer complimentary preliminary consultations. So if there's anything that interested you in today's webinar or in prior webinars, or even just regarding estate planning and asset protection, please feel free to contact the office and we can set up that complimentary preliminary consultation. In addition, our firm has many qualified speakers, so if you have a group of professionals who is interested in having a private conference on this or any other topic that we can speak about, we're always happy to entertain that and see if we can work it out. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.